Hey, yo, what up, guys? It's Karoki, and this is going to be a um, four-part series that I wanted to do just to, how can I put this? To correct some of the things that I've heard or some of the things that I've seen other people say or that have had opinions on Final Fantasy 14 dating back either like misunderstandings that they have recently or misunderstandings that they've had for years or whatever, because things have changed significantly over the years for Final Fantasy now that I've understood the structure of how everything progresses, so to speak. So, um, there's two main things, well, three main things that I wanted to talk about, and that's the reason why this is going to be a four-part series. Whenever I upload this first part, I'm going to start the recording for part two, then part three, then part four, etc. The first thing that I wanted to address was the speed of the game. The speed, the speed of the game slash the complexity of the power sets. Just to give an idea in terms of how these things work and how they evolve over time, because you have no idea of the decision-making processes that go on at in-game until you reach there and you read and understand the different power interactions that now exist that didn't previously. And these are things that have changed and have evolved over the years across the updates, across the DLCs that have released, because every time a DLC releases, unlike on DC, new abilities end up being added to the power set. So you have 4 to 5 new moves, you have balance changes every couple of months, things get moved around, shifted, interact differently, and over the course of several iterations, obviously it ends up making a big difference in some cases for very particular power sets. So for part one, I wanted to focus on Samurai because this was going to be the first job that I wanted to try to perfect or whatever, or get down at a really high fucking skill level, was just my Samurai DPS. And then I'm also going to briefly touch on Monk as well as Dragoon. Those are going to be part 2 and 3, because another comment that I've seen is that the playstyles are all the same, and so I want to go through and break down how they're similar at the baseline level, at the fundamental level, like say in the 30 to 50 area, and then show how they branch off significantly once you reach the highest tiers or whatever, to go through and to show how they all deviate into their own different play styles, their own problems, their own I guess you could say mechanics that you need to learn to master in order to be able to perform well or whatever. They all have slightly different niches that you have to be good at, but go through, do that for Samurai, Monk, and Dragoon. And then part 4, I was going to go through and actually show different things inside of the content in terms of the difficulty that ends up scaling, because what you see from 1 through 50 and even 50 through 60, 60 through 70, all of that is basically just a long tutorial. That tutorial starts to get good and fun around in the 50s if you run the right amount of content. But then even once you get to 50, 50 through 60 is a training ground, 60 through 70 is a different type of training ground, and 70 through 80 is where you basically put everything together that you've learned from ranking up into some actually hard content that gives you a good solid preview of what the in-game instances end up looking like. I haven't even gone into in-game content yet, just because I'm not, how can I put this? Even whenever I'm trying, which I've never been on stream, but even whenever I am trying, I'm still not satisfied with my performance. I'm not satisfied with my ability to remember the amount of mechanics that some instances require. And I know that I should be going into the content just to get practice, but I'm one of those guys, whenever I go into content, I want to be as best prepared as I can. So if I can't do a dungeon, or if I can't do an easier raid flawless as Samurai, I know good and damn well I can't go inside of a higher tier content without fucking up or whatever. I want to make sure that I master my power set to the best of my ability, to where I'm comfy, to where whenever I go inside of that higher content, I'm confident. And even if I make mistakes because of the mechanics, I know that my overall performance is still going to end up being significantly above average just because I've already perfected it in other situations. I want to have that experience. I want to have my rotations, my optimizations like the back of my fucking hand. That's just personally me. But anyway, to go ahead and get started with this video, with Samurai, I currently have my gear off because I wanted to show how this works whenever you first hit level 50, whenever you first unlock Samurai and start off. So there's one of the stats that people talk about in terms of the game. They talk about in terms of, one of the stats that is important to what people talk about the game is called skill speed / spell speed or whatever. And basically what this is, whenever you hit a move in Final Fantasy, not that, I forgot that I gotta change my hidden bar later. But whenever you hit a move, it goes on cooldown. So say I'm holding my right 2 trigger and I'm going to hit X, which is going to hit this little blue button, and you'll see the little white dot that's basically pulsing wherever I'm pushing. That's how you can track whatever button I'm hitting and that I'm talking about. So whenever I hit that, you see the little clock that ends up spinning around, and that is your GCD. That is your global cooldown. The vast majority of your powers are going to be on the global cooldown, and that global cooldown time before you can hit another move is by default 2.5 seconds or whatever. You're going to be close to that 2.5 seconds unless you gear specifically to go above that. Some of the gears that you get leveling up is pretty much going to force you to have skill speed that ends up lowering what this time is. This makes your auto attacks faster. This makes you being able to cast certain moves, what's the name of it? I guess you could say more frequently through your rotation, basically, or whatever. It speeds up everything. Your DOTs, blah, blah, blah. Well, I mean, not your DOTs, sorry. It increases the potency of the DOTs, but the DOT duration is still the same. But it'll speed up your basic rotation of weapon skills. So, as a side note, as a disclaimer, I am still learning all 3 of these power sets. I'm going to be referring to Samurai level 80, Dragoon, and Monk at level 70 because that's where they are. There were little bitty gameplay tricks and whatnot that I may forget or that I may not have discovered yet myself. I just want to talk about the ones that I know that I found so far that have already persuaded me that there's a big gap there, a bigger gap than what most people are willing to give credit for whenever it comes to optimizing each of those playstyles. Now, with that being said, how can I put this? So to start off with, Samurai at level 50, whenever you first unlock it, because the skill speed is so low, because you're only going to have a few hundred whenever you first hit level 50, your stats are low in damn near any gear that you're going to get at that level. And that's how it was, I'm assuming, back in the day, unless they changed the stats on the gear, which I doubt they did, unless there was like a huge numerical overhaul like what there was on fucking DC. But the skill speed is going to be low. And at least from the videos that I remember from back then, the skill speed is, well, whatever, was technically around this low back then. But regardless, the skill speed is low. And because the skill speed is low, the power set flows into a relatively simple rotation that doesn't actually evolve into that much. So let's just say at level 50, whenever you first unlock Samurai, just to give a basic foundation for it, Samurai is based on a 3 PI system. So if you look slightly below my character, you'll see 3 black circles. Each of those I'm just going to call a PI or whatever. It's really called a sin, but for those of you watching that are from DC or whatever, it's easier just to call it a PI, I guess you could say. It functions differently than a PI, but still, or whatever, it's basically a PI. Essentially, those 3 PIs are going to interact with this one move called Aijutsu, the little green blob looking thing. If I have 1 PI, aka 1 sin, I get a 60-second DOT. If I have 2 PIs, aka 2 sin, then I get Tenkagoken, which is a AoE burst cast move. If I have 3, then it ends up giving me Midari's Sensugeka, which is a single target burst, one of the hardest hitting in the game, if I remember correctly. And so essentially, the rotation is centered around using this ability for the rotation. So in order to get those 3 different PIs, each of those PIs is assigned a very specific move. The one that's on the lower left side is going to be linked with Gecko or whatever, which is this move. The one that's in the middle at the top of the pyramid is going to be Yuki Kaze, which is this move. And then Kasha is going to be the one on the bottom right, which is this move. And whenever I hit each of these moves, that PI is going to come up, which then I can use on Aijutsu in order to spin said Sen. But in order to be able to use Kasha, Gecko, Yuki Kaze, in order to get those PIs, I need to have the combo bonus. In order to get said combo bonus, I have to start at Hakaze or whatever and work my way up. So Hakaze's combo action can either go Hakaze as my one in terms of like 1, 2, 3s, like say AM era for DC. You would have Hakaze and then you could hit Yuki Kaze. That's just a 2-step. Or you could hit Hakaze, then go into Shifu, and then go into Kasha. That's how you end up getting the Kasha combo bonus in order to get the PI. Or you could go Hakaze, Jinpu, and then Gecko. Those are the 3 orders, and as you can see, I have them lined up as such on my loadout bar, positioned to where they are corresponding to where the Sen is. Gecko is on the left side of my loadout bar. Yuki Kaze is in the middle, in between Gecko and Kasha, and Kasha is all the way on the right side, so therefore I can clearly remember the paths, and just off of seeing where the Sen is, I know where I need to go in terms of my loadout. Now, whenever you go through and do this, let's say you just have, what's the name of just at a basic starting level. So let's say I want to lay my DOT first, basic principle inside of a game. So I'm going to hit and get 1 PI, and then I'm going to hit this move, and boom, now I have a 60-second DOT. Now, another thing is that Shifu, which is along the way to Kasha, and Jinpu along the way to Gecko, they also end up giving buffs. Shifu is a speed up and Jinpu is a damage buff, which means that those are 2 buffs that you need to be constantly doing and keeping up. Not really that important, considering that after you lay the DOT, the next thing you're doing is you're going for 3 PIs in order to get your burst. So say right now I'm going to go through and get Shifu since it just ran out. I'm going to go into Gecko in order to go ahead and get my Jinpu buff up. And then now I'm missing 1 Sen, I'm going to go into Yuki Kaze. And then now I have 3 PI and I can go into Midare. Now that ends up being the basic samurai rotation or whatever. The only other move that you have or whatever, I'm not going to talk about AoE. I'll talk about AoE whenever I get into complications because AoE is a lot simpler. The only other move that you have at level 50 whenever you first unlock Samurai is Mekkyo Shizui. And Mekkyo Shizui is basically just a shortcut. Instead of having to hit, say, Jinpu, Shifu, Hakaze, before I get to Kasha, Gecko, and Yuki Kaze, if I hit Mekkyo, this basically gives me 3 skips or whatever, which means I can just hit Gecko, Kasha, Yuki Kaze, and go straight into Midare at said point. So the way that ends up working is the ideal opener that you end up doing is, say you go for Kasha first, because apparently mathematically speaking getting the speed buff is better than getting the damage buff first. The damage buff, if I remember right, they said in the long term has a, I think it's like 40% chance in order to cause you a GCD, aka an extra cat's move, so they always end up going the speed route first. So you go up and you get your first PI. Now, the way that Samurai ends up working is that whenever you're running this in the higher up content with higher stats, it's really, really fucking hard to hit 2 moves in between the GCD. So let's just say, for example, say I hit Hakaze, I can hit this move that's up on my D-pad, Kaiten, the move that just came up with the arm flexing. I can hit that move in between the cooldown before I hit the next move. Normally that is called a single weave. The most you can do is 2 weaves in between abilities, but the faster your character is going, the harder it is to be able to do that. After a certain point of skill speed, it is impossible to actually double weave and get two different casts in between your GCDs. But the standard opener nonetheless is we're going to go for Kasha and get the first PI, and then we're going to go to Gecko, but we're going to actually stop. We're going to stop at Jinpu, and we're going to, sorry, Kaiten was a habit, not hit Kaiten. Not whatever, not yet at least, because we're still only level 50. After we hit Jinpu, we're going to lay the DLT. Now once we've done that, we still have the combo based proc for Gecko because we just hit Jinpu or whatever, at least temporarily or whatever. That'll be there for a few seconds and then it'll go away. The little dotted lines basically mean that that's a move that is available for use, but on your main GCDs, that basically tells you what ability you now have the combo prerequisite for. So you'll see the box gradually moving, but that's Akaze, then Jinpu, you lay the DLT, you hit Gecko, or whatever. Now I can use a shortcut move, or whatever. If I clip Gecko with the shortcut move, then now I can go straight into Kasha, straight into Yukikaze, and I can go into Midare, and I can hit Gecko again. Now Shifu is the lowest, what's the name of it? The lowest buff, so I normally always go through and hit that first. Hit Kasha, then go to Yukikaze, and then go into Midare. Now my Jinpu buff is low. Now I'm gonna go through and go back to Gecko. And whenever you do this, this ends up being a perfect loop or whatever whenever you go through and you do the rotation. So I'm just gonna go through and I'm actually going to finish this, and I'm going to empty all of my sins, and I'm just going to wait for all of my cooldowns just to show that this makes a perfect loop whenever you have low stats, because this ends up being important, because this ends up changing later on and not actually being the case anymore. So let me go through and let me just start the rotation off from scratch. Hopefully I don't fuck up my muscle memory from the in-game rotation in the process of making this video, starting off and showing how the rotation evolves and the different things that you have to keep track of. And now the Jinpu buff needs to be reset. Right here, the rotation has reset inside of a perfect loop, and I am right back to where I was before. This is a perfect 60-second cycle that is clean and neat and very simple at level 50 or whatever. And that is simply because my skill speed ends up being slow or whatever. My skill speed is low because the stats at that time did not exist in order to go as fast as what I could possibly go now, especially if I was to change my mods. But essentially, how can I put this? That's what your rotation looks like at level 50. That, to a regular person, is going to be boring or whatever. That is not anything, I guess you could say, complex. There's nothing really interesting or unique about it like that or whatever, but keep in mind this is baseline, and I'm going to be showing you the difference between 50 and level 80 as a samurai. So whenever you hit level 52, you end up unlocking Hisatsu Kaiten. This increases the potency of the next weapon skill by 50%, and this costs you 20 Kinky Gauge. Now Kinky Gauge I didn't talk about beforehand. Basically, whenever you land certain weapon skills such as Kasha, Yukikaze, and Gecko, they end up granting you Kinky Gauge. If you use these moves at a certain position, you regenerate additional Kinky Gauge. So let's say I'm sitting behind the target and I hit Kasha while I'm going through, I normally get 5 Kinky Gauge, but if I use it on the flank, which is the side of the target, it ends up granting me an additional 5 Kinky Gauge, so now I actually end up getting 10. Or whatever. Same thing goes for Gecko with it having the bonus Kinky here, and then Yukikaze doesn't have a positional bonus, but it grants 15 instead. It actually generates the most Kinky Gauge out of those two abilities. Now, With that being said, the kinky gauge, whenever you actually get into one of the higher levels, it actually starts regenerating faster, but I'll talk about that later. Right now you're at 52, and so your kinky gauge is very slow. You're pretty much only going to have enough kinky to use chitin maybe once every blue moon extra, in addition to the purpose that it has foundationally. So foundationally, what chitin is meant for is you want to use this on your hardest hitting weapon skills that you have. The thing is, everything inside of Aijutsu is a weapon skill. So your 60-second DLT along with your buff or whatever, your 3PI burst move, is going to be a weapon skill that chitin is going to buff. So chitin is going to be used every single time before you hit a Midare, every single time before you hit Hikabana. So your rotation then goes into something like this. You end up starting off going into Kasha and getting your first PI. Now I'm going to go to the backside just to pre-position for Gecko. I'm going to hit Jinpu, buff up Hikabana with chitin. Gecko, Nekyo, get in position for Kasha positional. And then clip Kasha, go into Midare, and then hit Gecko, and then I am back into the position or whatever, back into the rotation that I was at beforehand, with making sure that every time I finish my 3PI and I'm about to go into Midare, that I hit that chitin beforehand. Very small rotational change, just something extra to go through and to clip in between your power sets. That ends up being something extra every blue moon that you end up clipping in, and that's unlocked at level 52. Okay, a little bit better, ever so slightly better, not too much. Still very boring, still not managing that much, still not very thought-provoking. Okay, cool. Let's go up to level 54 and level 56, since both of these are intertwined. So another move that you have ranking up is NP. NP is a ranged, what's the name of it? Is a ranged attack. So NP, or whatever, just does damage out of range. It doesn't actually do anything. What's the name of it? It just does that. But essentially, whenever you unlock the back steps, the back step actually ends up, how can I put this? It ends up upgrading the NP. So the first move you will technically unlock is the dash in. The dash in ends up costing you kinky gauge that you just spent on chitin or whatever previously beforehand. This allows you to go through and to dash into a target to be within melee range. You should pretty much be starting all of the boss fights like that, since the tanks are going to be pulling from a range, at least whenever you can. I'd probably, like, if I had to take a guess, if I had no fucking kinky gauge at all, as if I just wiped, I might actually end up doing fucking MP into fucking Iki Shoten, because I have to hit something in order to get into combat to be able to use Iki Shoten. I'll talk about Iki Shoten later, but that essentially generates my fucking kinky gauge, and so if I hit a range move then hit Iki Shoten, then I'd be able to fucking dash in immediately after. I don't know if it'd be better for me to just sprint in, but we'll get into that logistics later. So main point right now is that the jump back actually ends up enhancing this range attack. So this jump back costs you 10 kinky gauge or whatever. So whenever I hit this, it's going to launch me back, and you see that there's the dotted line around MP, which is, or MP, whichever you want to pronounce it. And basically, whenever it becomes enhanced, it has a little bit over triple damage, and it increases my kinky gauge by 10. Now, the interesting part about this interaction is that Yaten costs 10 kinky gauge and MP regenerates 10. However, the dash back in after you do that is going to end up costing you 10 kinky gauge as well, which means even whenever you go through and you perform this combo, you will still end up netting a 10 kinky gauge loss. Now, the important part about this is that there's a few things to note. One, most of the time you're going to be using this to technically dodge AoE attacks, in which case that is a skill that you have to hone once you unlock these two abilities. So previously, before you unlock 54 and 56, you're just going to be going through doing your combo. If the boss does an AoE attack near you, you're going to just weave out and then you're going to weave back in or whatever. That's all that you're going to end up doing or whatever. That's how you dodge AoEs. You just simply move out of the range and then you're able to do it. Now where these moves become useful is, let's say the boss has an AoE that goes out to about right here. Now if it goes out to something like this, if I'm here, I can't go through and wait to the last minute, because if I wait to the last minute, I have to walk all of this. If I just hit a move, it's still going to take me like 1.5 seconds in order to actually get out of the range of it. That's like over half of the cast time of that move that's probably going to detonate. I'm going to die if I end up waiting to like halfway through the cast bar to try to run away. Not to mention that by the time I get all the way back out here, I'm not doing auto attacks, I'm not doing anything, and then I have to come all the way back in. That is a 1.5 seconds that I am losing coming back out, and that I am coming back in that I am not getting any damage in. The most that I can do is just run away and then hit MP, and then go through and try to continue my combo like that. What that dodge allows you to do is that dodge, having the jump back and the jump back in, they allow you to essentially keep your DPS up, because both of these actually do damage. They have 100 potencies on top of them, and they're going to increase the damage of MP by triple. So instead of having to leave the boss early, say instead of hitting Hakaze and then walking away, and then say hitting MP and then coming back in and having to start off Hakaze again, you now have two choices now. If I came in and I hit Hakaze, because I can stay in longer because the jump back is so fast, now I can hit Shifu and then jump back. Or whatever. Now I can't Shifu and jump back. I just got 100 potency from the jump back, which is the same potency that I would have had from MP previously. And then I have a fucking jump back, which basically saves me another 1.5 seconds from having to walk back to the target. Plus I got another 100 potency added into that. Now, this is another decision that you normally end up having to make, is whether or not do you want to actually use MP whenever you actually end up doing that, whenever you end up doing that dodge. Because what ends up happening is whenever you do a combo, whenever you're building up a combo, say going to a Akasha or going to a Gecko, there ends up, you can end up breaking that if you go into something else. I can't just hit Hakaze and then Shifu, and then go into Jinpu, and then go back into Kasha. I can't build them up at different points. If I'm going along one path, I have to stay on that path and do those moves in that specific order. So whenever you go through, and let's say I hit Hakaze, and then I hit Shifu, and then I end up doing that jump back, and say I hit MP, and then go back in, I just lost Shifu, which means now if I was inside of my rotation, I now have to hit Hakaze, Shifu again, and then I can go in Akasha. I now just lost 2 GCD casts at that point, or whatever. I just lost 2 moves inside of my rotation. I'm 2 moves behind in terms of my fucking loadout because I decided to use MP at a range. Now, what you can decide to do instead is you can go through and just say, okay, fuck MP if I'm that far into my fucking combo. If I have Shifu here and I need to dodge, I'm just going to jump back in, and then I can continue with Kasha as if nothing had happened. All I did was just lose like 1 small second on my rotation. That isn't going to be too bad, especially if that ended up happening during the cooldown. If I ended up hitting, say, if I ended up hitting that jump step right after Shifu, it's like, it's not that long of a time period to technically mess up your rotation, especially if you have something else going on, or if you make mistakes ever so often. That's going to correct itself. That's not too big of an issue or whatever. That ends up being a lot better, because having to go through and to cast 2 extra moves or whatever is more punishing. How can I put this? Not using the enhanced MP is more of a punishment than what losing 2 GCDs is, especially depending on that particular boss fight. But that is going to be a choice that you end up making and reacting to inside of content. Either you are going to walk out of the AoE if it's small enough, and you're going to continue, because keep in mind, doing these dashbacks, especially if you're not using MP, this is a 20 kinky gauge loss at this point. This is 20 kinky gauge that you are spending on 200 potency, which technically you could be spending on several hundred, or later on you could be spending on, say, 320, which is a 50% or whatever, which is almost a 50% increase on how much damage output you're getting for, say, kinky gauge. So this isn't something that you want to be doing all the time, unless it's necessary, especially since, as I just showed, it does technically delay your rotation. If you can just hit a move and then walk out of it and then come back in, that is technically ideal. But if you want to squeeze in one extra cast, depending on the timing of it as well, if you can squeeze in that extra GCD, that extra time that you spend jumping back isn't that bad. Not to mention that, especially if whenever you squeeze in that extra move, you actually end up finishing the combo. So say I end up finishing Kasha and then I want to jump back. Well, now that I finished Kasha, I'm not inside of a combo. Now I can go through and do the full range combo, and then I can come back in and I can continue my rotation. So just adding 54 and 56, this adds a different element of dodging into the samurai kit. Or whatever. Those are decisions that you have to make in terms of optimizing your DPS while you are dodging. Not to mention that in the higher levels, not so much prevalent now, but I think you haven't reached it yet. Let me just go through and let me just check. Yeah, whatever. At level 52, you end up getting it, but at level 62 is whenever you get the upgrade. So right now, depending on how you use Hisatsu Kaiten, what part of your rotation you're in, whether or not you just wiped, there may be times you may not actually have enough Kinky to be able to jump back and then hit in ranged MP and then dash back or whatever. Like say for example, if you only had 10 Kinky gauge at the time because you just hit off a Hisatsu Kaiten, if you only have 10 Kinky gauge, you're going to jump back, you're going to hit in ranged MP, and you're going to end up coming back to what's the name of it, you're still going to end up being at 0 Kinky gauge at the end of that. If you started off with only 5, you wouldn't even be able to jump back to begin with, and that becomes a fucking issue because sometimes, especially later on, because there's other uses for fucking Kinky gauge, you end up mismanaging your fucking Kinky gauge, and that ends up being a problem. So I'll talk about that once we get there. We're almost there. Next move is Merciful Eyes at level 58. Merciful Eyes is what I consider to be a training move for samurais. So early on or whatever, at level 6 or whatever, they give you access to Third Eye, which is a move that reduces how much damage you take for 3 seconds. Somewhat useful, not extraordinarily important. Mostly it's the additional effect that ends up being important, is that it grants the eyes open effect whenever you get hit. And so essentially what this becomes is this becomes a preemptive shield that can grant you more DPS or more healing. So normally in game, I don't normally use Merciful Eyes. I use it inside of open world if I need the extra heals, especially if I'm fighting a whole bunch of ads or something along those lines and I just need those extra little nudges, I'll go through and use it. But normally I use this as a training exercise. So essentially what you do is you end up, you're going through your regular rotation and you're going to go through and you're going to hit Third Eye in between your GCDs. And what that is that's going to give you a 3-second window or whatever in order to get hit. If you get hit inside of that 3-second window, you're going to be granted the eyes open status effect. And what that does is that allows you to go through and to heal yourself using Merciful Eyes. It gives you a 200 instant heal potency. Now, that is somewhat useful, but essentially what that does is that changes it, because now instead of having to worry about just AoEs, now you're also going to be looking at what previously we'd like to call unavoidable AoE damage. The bosses will occasionally go through, normally somewhere around once a minute, because I've started watching them for my tanks for the reprisal cooldown, which basically for those that don't play tanks, reprisal is just a 10% damage reduction to enemies nearby. So whenever the boss does an AoE attack, it reduces that just a little bit or whatever. At least should be doing that. If there's some fucking kink with that I don't know about, then but that's one of the things that I've been doing. Theoretically should work. If it doesn't, that's a detail I have to learn. But essentially you have to look for those moments, and what's the name of it, whenever that ends up happening, you want to Third Eye that. You want to go through and you're going to be able to reduce that damage by 10%, once more assuming that you can do that. And it doesn't say bypass shield mechanics like this, or damage, or not shield mechanics, damage reduction effects like this, which I believe it does, because I think we've used it a few times or whatever, and we've stacked a few effects and it's been a noticeable amount that we didn't get chunked by, so it should work. But you'll end up reducing that damage by a little bit, but more importantly, you'll be able to heal back some of it. But later on, skipping ahead to level 66 or whatever, also while you're under that effect, you can go through and use Hisatsu Saigen, which basically allows you to spend your kinky gauge on extra damage or whatever. So I will go through and I will be doing my rotation, and I will hit third eye, the damage will come in, I'll hit Hisatsu Saigen in between on the next OGCD, and now that becomes an extra clippable move that I can put inside of my rotation. Now, why does that become important or whatever? Why does that end up increasing the skill gap? One, that's something extra you have to go through and you have to look for. Now, that is a cast bar on each and every single individual boss, every single, well, I don't want to say every single individual ad, but every single ads that you will have to go through and you will have to be looking for in order to maximize your damage. Anytime there's damage coming in that you will not be able to avoid, you want to have this third eye proccing in order to maximize your DPS. Because, let me just go ahead briefly, meditate you end up unlocking at level 60. Meditate, not too important. This one is mostly for only useful during boss phase outs because you have to be inside of combat to use it. Essentially, let's say this striking target is the boss and I'm going through and I'm attacking it, and I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to get rid of my kinky gauge just to go through and actually show how this ends up working. So I don't have any kinky gauge, and let's say the boss phases out and they go, what's the name of it? The boss phases out and there's a whole bunch of AoEs on the floor, and there's only going to be one particular spot that's going to be safe. I go to that safe zone where I'm not going to be hit by the AoEs, and then I can go through and I can hit meditate since I am now in combat and unable to hit anything, and I will gradually restore my kinky gauge, which is going to allow me to do my dashes, which is going to allow me to go through and to do extra DPS through the clipping moves that I have. That just becomes one of those things where it allows you to squeeze out a little bit of DPS if it's something that you remember to go through and use, because kinky gauge ends up being very important later on, especially in terms of trying to squeeze out your DPS and to avoid certain mismanagement and mistakes that you can end up making. So right now you've hit level 60, you have a few extra things to worry about. You have to go through and you have to make sure that you get that 50% buff on your DOT, that 50% buff on your, what's the name of it, on your biggest burst, and you have extra things, extra choices to make whenever you're doing ads or whenever you're doing bosses and you're dodging AoEs between the jump back and the jump forward. You have third eye that you're now watching the proc on in order to be able to either heal yourself or to be able to do extra damage. So now you're watching the boss cast attacks, and you're also making decisions based on where you are in your rotation in terms of how you break it in order to avoid that mechanic. And whenever AoEs come out or the boss ends up phasing out, you need to be making sure in order to hit meditate in order to keep your kinky gauge up. Cool, not too bad now. Now going ahead, at 62 you end up unlocking Hisatsu Shinten. Hisatsu Shinten, for lack of better words, is just a clippable move that's meant to do damage with your kinky gauge. So let's say I have a whole bunch of kinky gauge. I'm just going to hit, I'm just going to go through and hit Hakaze and then hit that move, Hakaze, hit that move, and then blah, blah, blah. If I have extra kinky gauge, I can go through and I can clip that in. This move is unlocked at level 62, which if I remember right, is also where they start to give you kinky gauge when landing everything. So now instead of just getting kinky gauge on, say, Kasha, instead of just getting kinky gauge on Yugi Kaze, instead of just getting it on, say, Gecko, now Hakaze end up giving it, now Jinpu ends up giving it, now Shifu ends up giving it. I'll end up getting kinky gauge on every single move that I hit. And what that does is that regenerates your kinky gauge significantly faster. However, mathematically, you don't want to keep using it on Hisatsu Kaiten. This move being on Higabana as an example, this ends up being a 800, what is this, 800, this ends up being a 1050 potency over time. So you're basically getting like 500 extra potency from using Kaiten on Higabana, and then if you use it on Midari, that ends up being a 400 potency as well. So you're looking at 400, 500 potency, aka damage that you're basically going to be getting from using it on these two moves, compared to the next hardest hitting thing on your kit is going to end up being Kasha or Gecko, which is only a 240 increase. Now compare that 240 increase to 320 from Shinten, you're probably going to want to go through and fucking do this. It's like, even though this is 25 kinky gauge as opposed to, how can I put this? Even though it's only 25 kinky gauge as opposed to 20, the math still ends up being inside of the favor of Shinten. Shinten is better than you using Kaiten on Kasha or Gecko as alternative means of getting rid of your kinky gauge. Hisatsu Kyuten just ends up being basically the AoE version of Shinten. That is just something that you use in order to clip in order to not release, to expend your Kinky Gauge while still dealing extra damage in between your GCDs. That is still relatively simple. Now, the issue is that with increased, I was like, it's fucking cheesy as this line is for fucking movies. With increased, what is it? With more power comes more responsibility. So I'm gonna go ahead and save the clip because I know it's been a second, and then I'm gonna go ahead and continue. Okay, so with more power comes greater responsibility, blah blah blah. Essentially what that means in this case is that your Kinky is regenerating faster, which means that you're going to need to watch how fast you spend it because you still have bare minimums that you're still going to need. So in other words, you have a lower ceiling. So say for example, you never want to get, how can I put this? You never want to spam Shinten or Kyuten enough to where you don't have Hisatsu Kaiten anymore. Because if I go through and say, let's try, okay, now I'm at 5. 5 might work out a little bit better. Let's try 5. Yep, 5 works out better. So if my Kinky Gauge is actually here, now whenever I go in order to do Hikabana, assuming I didn't have 2 PIs, if I was trying to do Hikabana at that point, I wouldn't be able to, or whatever. I could do Hikabana, but I wouldn't be able to use the Kaiten on it. I'd be stuck at 10 Kinky Gauge instead. So the finickiness on the numbers, because the Kinky Gauge that you end up spending along with generating from the different parts of your rotation, whenever you switch the order of things, your Kinky ends up being off. But the important part is that your Kaiten becomes a minimum. You always want to be able to have 20 Kinky Gauge whenever you need it in order to be able to use Kaiten. Otherwise, you're going to end up fucking yourself and you're going to end up missing a large amount of potency from not having that buff on Hikabana or Midare or whatever. Not to mention that whenever you're dodging mechanics, you're going to also end up needing to do Hisatsu Gyoten or Hisatsu Yaten. So let's say, for example, I'm going through my rotation and say whatever, let's just say I'm doing, let's just say I have 2 PIs already up, aka 2 Sen already up, and I'm going into Yukikaze. If I hit Hakaze and then hit Shinten or whatever, and then hit Yukikaze, but then the boss does a mechanic or whatever, how can I put this? If my Kinky Gauge is low for whatever reason, I'm not going to actually end up having it, because essentially, how can I put this? Actually, this probably isn't a fucking good example to use. Let me not use Yukikaze, because Yukikaze regenerates 15. I want to use, yeah, technically one of these is technically better because it only regenerates 10, but I want to only regenerate 5. Yeah, let's say I only regenerate 5. So let me hit Hakaze. So let's say I just went through and I just finished one of my things. Let me just get rid of that Kinky Gauge. Let's say I'm sitting at 0 Kinky Gauge because whenever I was going through my rotation, I ended up hitting what's the name of a Shinten, and I ended up bottoming out on my Kinky Gauge. I hit Hakaze, I only have 10, boss AoE comes up that I need to dodge. I no longer have the Kinky Gauge in order to jump back, which means now I have no choice but to just manually walk out and just use fucking MP at that point or whatever. That ends up being a fucking thing. Now, thank God you can go through and MP ends up actually granting a little bit of Kinky, so at least you'll be able to jump back in, but you're still going to be bottomed out, which is going to be good or bad depending on what ends up happening next. But essentially, one thing you don't want to be happening is you don't want to be panicking, because you can get fucking Shinten happy and you're going to fuck up in that aspect. You're going to miss some Kaitens, you're going to not be able to jump back, and you're going to sit there and you're going to try to do the clip and you're going to be like, wait, why am I not jumping back? Oh shit, I don't have the Kinky Gauge. And then you're going to have to try to walk out before the AoE fucking smashes you. God forbid you ended up waiting to the last minute to dodge the AoE, and then now you're getting fucking smashed because now you don't have the time in order to dodge the AoE anymore. So that ends up being a thing or whatever. You now have a lower ceiling. You need enough to where you can use Kaiten, and you want to make sure that you always have enough to be able to dodge mechanics if you're going to be using Gyoten and Yaten reactively inside of content. If you don't already have these things, I guess you could say, pre-planned out using the simulators and the other tools that are inside the Discord / other people have online. So with that being said, you end up having that or whatever, that ends up being a thing. You also need Kinky Gauge to be able to use Hisatsu Saigen. And going back to what I mentioned beforehand with Third Eye, Hisatsu Saigen ends up being better than what Shinten is in terms of the potency. That's going to end up being a small DPS increase. So even with Shinten, you still want to be going through and fishing for those Third Eye procs every single time that you can. Which means that you eventually need to learn what every single boss cast does, because if it does damage to you, you're going to need to Third Eye it. If you have AoEs coming out from the boss, you're going to need to Third Eye it. If an ad spawns and is going to get an auto attack on you, you need to Third Eye it. If there's going to be a little symbol that comes above your head and everybody needs to spread out so you don't overlap a fucking meteor coming down on your fucking head, you need to Third Eye it. Every single damage source that you have coming into you, you want to be hitting Third Eye on it in order to squeeze out that extra DPS. Or whatever. That is your, that is your new, how can I put this? Your new somewhat of a gap creator. Optimizing the jump backs is going to be a thing. Not fucking up on the kinky management of Kaiten is going to be a thing, but then also farming those third procs, those Third Eye procs as well as meditate is going to be another gap creator in terms of skill level between different samurais at this point so far. Now, Hagakure, whenever I first got it at level 68, level 60 gear gives a little bit more skill speed, not that much to where I didn't actually need to use Hagakure. Hagakure was one of those moves whenever I first saw it, I was like, this move is fucking trash. It serves no fucking purpose. This shit is garbage. I don't know why the fuck I would even put this on my fucking loadout. I'd never want to fucking get rid of my fucking PIs. The fuck would I do that for unless the shit was just over? If it was like the end of ads, maybe, but I could always just go into fucking Midari instead or whatever shit. Fuck that. I don't need anything. My rotation is fine as is. I don't fucking need Hagakure because everything is perfectly fine and fucking dandy. And everything is or whatever. My logic at that time wasn't completely fucking wrong. Whenever you're in the 50s and 60s, your gear doesn't have enough skill speed for things to be fucked up and fucking chaotic at that point. Things haven't gotten out of control yet. But then as soon as I hit level 70, that's when shit hit me and I was like, oh, that's when I fucking use Hagakure. I was like, okay, because basically, the fucking or whatever. Whenever I hit level 70, I went through and I got some Tombstone gear. And for those that don't know, Tombstone gear, is what's the name of it? I think it's like the ancient tombstones of fucking poetics. And essentially, like you end up getting them from running certain content, but you can spend tomes to get gear and also to upgrade that gear to be at a high level. And essentially for whenever I was first ranking up as tank or whatever, it was good because that gear was strong enough to last me into the highers of that level. So say level 50 tombstone gear, I wouldn't be replacing until I hit like 57 to 59. If I got level 60 gear, then I wouldn't be replacing it until 67 to 69. It basically lasts me throughout that entire DLC, throughout that entire fucking range as a tank in terms of my tankiness. And so I had that same principle going forward as a DPS, especially since it allows me to go through and to roll need/greed on every single gear piece instead of being locked from being able to roll on it because I was already wearing it or had it inside of my inventory. So let me go through and let me switch back. Let me go through and switch back to my regular samurai gear. So now my skill speed is 2320. Roughly speaking, this is around what my gear was. I'm inside of 80 gear right now, but whenever I was level 70, the tombstone gear from level 70 gave me damn near the amount of skill speed that I have now. I think it was a little bit higher or a little bit less. It wasn't this exact number because this number is damn near perfect for one of the fucking skill tiers where you can go through and do this. But even then, I still have to use Hagakure. Because essentially what happens is once you build up enough skill speed, because keep in mind this is what 4, 5 to 8 times as much skill speed as what you normally would have had in say the 50 to 60 category or whatever. Your skill speed ends up being high because the gear has scaled a fucking shitload. But whenever you have this level of skill speed, whenever I try to do that same rotation, look what happens now. I'm gonna start off and I'm gonna go in Akasha. Going through, everything's fine. I hit Jinpu, I hit Kaiten, I go into Hikabana, Gecko, Mekyo Shizuru, Kasha, Yukikaze, into Kaisen, into Shoha, back into Gecko. Going through my rotation, everything is perfectly motherfucking fine and dandy at this point. I'm gonna go through, just get some Shintens in just because I can. I'm gonna go through, get back on the backside just so I can go through and already be here for Gecko. And now I am leaning toward the second Midare. Going toward Kasha. Kaiten, hit this. Okay, the rotation is about to reset, so now I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna hit Kasha again. I'm gonna hit this dot. Oh, look at that. Mekyo is still 2 seconds off of cooldown. It's still, well, not 2 seconds, it's still 4 seconds off of cooldown. I can't lay Higabana and then hit that. Or whatever. But then keep in mind, even if I would ever, so it's like, okay, I have like 2-3 extra casts before I get to that point. Okay, what the fuck am I supposed to do? It's like, well, if I already have 1 PI from hitting Kasha, if I go through and say I spend those extra 2 casts to hit, say, Hakaze and then Yukikaze, it's like, hold up. Like, let's say I go through and I do this, and I say, oh, okay, I just need an extra 2 casts beforehand. I'll just go through and I'll just be slick and I'll just use fucking Yukikaze. Well, guess what? Now you no longer have the fucking, what's the name of it? Now you no longer have the fucking PI. And if you break Jinpu to go through and do Jinpu into Kaiten, into Higabana, and then you go back into Yukikaze, it doesn't fucking work anymore. Regardless of which method you pick, it doesn't fucking work anymore. Or whatever, that rotation doesn't work. You'd have to go through and fuck up the rotation and do something like this. You'd have to start off and then go into, what's the name of it, start off with Kasha, and then you go into Jinpu, into Kaiten, into Higabana, then hit Gecko, and then Mekyo still is going to be on cooldown. Now you have to hit Yukikaze, but then even if you do this, now your rotation is all off now. Now your rotation is not what it is because now Higabana is now misaligned with Mekyo Shizui. Whatever, my Mekyo Shizui is now on the exact same timer as Higabana, which is not what it was beforehand, which means the next time I go through my rotation again, it's still going to be misaligned. And I'm going to have to go through and change my rotation again to try to correct it in order to, I guess you could say, maximize my fucking cast. It becomes sloppy as fuck at that point. Or whatever, that small increase going from a 2.5 GCD to a 2.3 because now you have more gear and you have higher skill speed, that just fucked up your rotation. You were perfectly fine and whatever, and everything was smooth until level 70, and then all of a sudden your gear has now fucked you. So now, what you have to do is you have to use Hagakure or whatever in order to correct that mistake. So you start off and you go into Kasha just like what you did normally, and you end up going into, what's the name of it, Jinpu, just like what you did beforehand. Or whatever, this is the same opener as what we were doing before. Gecko into Mekyo Shizui, Kasha, Yukikaze, into Kaiten, into that, back into Gecko. Just because that's my personal preference. Technically, you can, the last move that you go into is your personal preference. I just like going into Gecko just so I don't have to fucking move. But going through, still doing the exact same rotation as before. I'm just going through and I'm just clipping in Shinten just because. Now this is about to be the second Midari that I do. This second Midari that I do, I know the next one is technically where I'm supposed to be resetting my loadout. But I can't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to act like I'm going to a Gecko. And I'm going to use Hagakure. And I'm going to just go through and get the extra sin. And then I'm going to restart back up on Kasha. So now both of my buffs have been reset basically to make sure that I have those up. And now I can go through and do the same opener that I was in. Now I'm back in that smooth, what's the name of it, transition that I was at beforehand, where now I have a smooth 60-second rotation where I'm not having to go back and recompensate for anything. Hagakure is used to correct your rotation. And this is going to happen at different points or whatever. This is going to be used every 60 seconds whenever you're going through your base rotation, but then it's also going to be used whenever you need to do certain things. So say for example, let's say I just finished doing AoE. Just to give a quick recap of AoE, it's basically a 1-2 combo. You go Fuga into Mangetsu, or you do Fuga into fucking Oka. Fuga into Mangetsu, aka going to the left on my fucking screen, it gives me the left PI, and then going Fuga into Oka gives me the right PI. Or whatever. Let's say I just finished ads and I have 2 PIs at this point. This is a fucking AoE move. I can't use this on a fucking boss or whatever. I don't want to use that on a single target. The thing is, the only option you have if you don't want to waste that PI now is to go through and to do Yukikaze and then do Kaiten and then go into a Midare or whatever at the start of the boss. And technically that's acceptable or whatever. It wouldn't be that bad. However, what happens if you have a boss that phases out within the first within the first minute of the boss fight? If you end up doing that and you delay doing Higabana, which is over 1,000 potency, if you delay putting out that DLT, that could actually end up decreasing your DPS. There are cases where instead of going through and doing Midare and then laying your DLT afterward, because keep in mind, if I already had 2 PIs, I'm gonna come in and I'm going to get that 3rd PI from, say, Yukikaze. I'm doing Kasha right now, but I get it from Yukikaze. I'd have to come in, do those 2 GCDs, hit this, and then I'm gonna have to go through and build up Kasha again, or whatever. Not Kasha again. You're gonna have to go up and build one of them again, and then you can go into your fucking rotation in order to lay Hikabana. Hikabana has just been delayed by 2 GCDs. Well, sorry, take that back, 3 GCDs, because technically you're going to have the cast of you're going to have the cast of Midare as well. You're going to have the 2 Yukikaze procs plus that or whatever. That's going to end up fucking you. God forbid if you had, say, what's the name of it? God forbid if you had, say, I don't know, say you had the left side and you hit this and then only 1 ad was left, so you just went through and you just hit Yukikaze or whatever because it was gonna die. You wanted to maximize your damage on that single ad left, so you went through and you hit Yukikaze instead of going to Kasha. Okay, now you have to go through, if you wanted to go into Midare, now you have to do 3 GCDs. So you do 3 GCDs and go into another Midare once the boss ends up starting, and then you can go through and do it. Now your DOT is technically 4 GCDs behind, or whatever. That ends up being an issue compared to just being able to, how can I put this? That ends up being an issue compared to just turning it into Sin. Turning it into Sin allows you to start off your rotation clean, because especially if there are certain mechanics that will distance you from the boss, or the boss is going to time out at certain times, it's going to be better to have all of your damage applied up front or whatever. Whether or not you start off with a burst or whether or not you start off with a DOT is going to depend on the content, because there are some cases where you do start off with Midare first and then you go into Hikabana afterward, but technically the standard for the most upfront damage, assuming nothing is going to happen, is having Hikabana first and then going into Midare. So that ends up being something that you end up using Hagakure for. Hagakure is for fixing your rotation and allowing you to put yourself back into that loop that you're supposed to be in as a samurai or whatever. That ends up being really, really good for resource management, especially if, let's say, for example, you ended up being fucking Q10 happy, which is the AoE version of fucking Shinten. God forbid you got fucking Q10 happy and you ended up spending all of your fucking Kinky Gauge on fucking Q10 and you have absolutely none fucking left. You can't even dash into the boss whenever the fucking tank starts. But if you go through and you go ahead and what's the name of it, turned in Hagakure would have given you like 20 Kinky Gauge. So now you have the Kinky Gauge that you need in order to rush in order to start the boss. Otherwise you'll lose DPS from that, because now you're having to do some bullshit like MP while fucking sprinting toward the boss now or whatever, instead of being able to dash in and immediately start your rotation. Because keep in mind, since you didn't do the jump back, MP is just a 100 potency compared to just the dash in from fucking Gyoten or whatever. It's still going to be 100 potency, but it's going to let you get to the boss faster, and it's going to save you a sprint cast trying to fucking do that. God forbid you need sprint within the first minute in order to dodge a mechanic, because now you're fucked. So moving forward, in addition to Hagakure, there's Iki Shoten. Iki Shoten basically does the reverse of what having all of these little Kinky Gauge managements or whatever ended up doing. Whenever I said beforehand that you had a floor for how much kinky gauge you wanted to have. So say you always wanted to have 20 kinky gauge in order to use Kaiten, you always wanted to have 10 kinky gauge in case you wanted to reactively dash back from the boss. No, whatever, that's the ceiling, and you say, okay, I never want to get below this set amount. Now you have a ceiling. Now you never want to get above, you will never want to be at or higher than 50 kinky gauge when Ikki Shoten is coming off a cooldown, because essentially this is going to overcap you. The highest amount of kinky gauge that you can have is 100, which means that if you hit Ikki Shoten and go over 100 kinky gauge, that is lost kinky gauge, which in turn is lost damage.